Okay, we should be live. Let me just triple check. While I'm doing that, I just want to welcome everyone to tonight's board meeting of the Police Accountability Board. We are thrilled to have with us some special guests. Let me just triple check that we're all good on Facebook. We should be all right. Okay, Chair, you want to get this meeting started?
Yep. Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. It is the 13th of May, and we're here with our weekly Police Accountability Board meeting. So we are it's going to be a packed meeting. So we are very lucky to have a lot of experience coming to talk to us about what it is like to run police accountability boards, what it's like to be at the forefront of reimagining policing in different parts of the country. And we are really excited, interested, and have a lot of questions about their expertise and about their experiences. And so we're looking forward to hearing what they have to say. And I do want to go ahead, though, and get to the minutes that we can go ahead and approve those. So Connor, can you go ahead and get those ready, please?
Yes. So these are the meetings from last week.
Okay, and how many is over here? One, two, three, four. Okay. Okay, if everybody's all set, I'll take a motion to approve the minutes.
Motion.
Second. Okay. All right. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5 of us, 6 of us. So Rabbi and Dr. Harvey, we're going to move. We're going to vote to approve the minutes. Are you ready to vote?
Yes. Sorry, I raised my hand. I realize you can't see me yet. I'm having some trouble with my camera.
All right. So all in favor of approving the minutes? Okay.
Yes. Sorry.
And Dr. Harvey? Okay, not there. All right, so Danielle?
Yes.
Okay, all right, so.
I had gave them the initial motion.
Oh, I see. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and move on to the next part of our meeting, please.
Okay. Well, I'll do the introductions here. So folks, we are so happy to have the leadership of Smk Consulting with us. Smk Consulting is a team of subject matter experts with experience of over 75 years in fields of criminal defense, prosecution, teaching law, leading complex investigations, and maybe most importantly, instituting transformative change. You know, Smk does a lot of different kinds of work, including restructuring and revamping institutional culture within law enforcement and prosecutorial and administrative investigatory offices. Hold on one second. I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just, Chair Wilson, can you just tell Bob that he's in the wrong meeting?
Sure will. Okay.
I'm so sorry, everyone. So Smk Consulting does so much different kinds of work. I can't even cover all of it. Their experience is so broad, but here's something very important. They do specialized training and rebuilding for administrative and investigative agencies, targeted training for police oversight agencies and other agencies that deal with officer-involved misconduct and shootings. And so they have a ton of expertise. And I want to introduce you to the 3 folks who are with us tonight. First, I want to talk about Mina Malik. Mina Malik is a lecturer in law at Harvard Law School. She most recently served as the Deputy Attorney General for Public Safety at the Office of the Attorney General for the District of Columbia. Ms. Malik also served as the Executive Director for New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board. That's their PAB. Over there, their CCRB, that's what they call it, investigated and prosecuted allegations of police misconduct against members of NYPD. And while Ms. Malik was leading the agency, those investigations included the high-profile cases like that of Eric Garner. While there, Ms. Malik launched the Interactive Data Transparency Initiative, which was the first of its kind to be implemented by a police oversight agency. During her time at CCRB, she transformed the organization at just about every level. She enhanced investigations and training, made prosecutions more proactive, gathered more data, conducted more data analysis, improved reporting on policing issues, and created community outreach. So that's Mina Malik. We also have Ron Sullivan, Professor Ron Sullivan from Harvard Law School. He's a leading theorist in the areas of criminal law, criminal procedure, trial practice techniques, legal ethics, and race theory. He's the Jesse Klemenko Clinical Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and director of the Harvard Criminal Justice Institute and the Harvard Trial Advocacy Workshop. Didn't know you could do that many things at once, but apparently at Harvard, it's all possible. Professor Sullivan was recruited to design and implement the conviction review unit for the Brooklyn District Attorney Ken Thompson. So since that unit launched about 7 years ago, the unit's exonerated and freed 26 wrongfully convicted people. Professor Sullivan is sought out to represent many clients, including the family of Michael Brown in Ferguson. He has won the release of more wrongfully incarcerated people, over 6,000, than anyone else in U.S. history. He's also an institution builder. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina, he designed an indigent defense delivery system that resulted in the release of all of the thousands of wrongfully incarcerated inmates, those people who got locked up wrongfully in the wake of the hurricane. He also served as the chair for the Criminal Justice Advisory Committee for then Senator Barack Obama's presidential campaign and served in important roles during the transition. Finally, with us tonight, we have Thomas Kim. Thomas has over 25 years of public service in law enforcement and military intelligence and operations for the U.S. Armed Forces. He served as the first deputy chief for the city of Chicago's Civilian Office of Police Accountability. That's that city's PAB, where he led the agency's overhaul, which included doing things like assessing all current staff and management. He implemented strategic recruitment programs. He developed and spearheaded a new training program for all staff. He coordinated officer-involved shooting specialist training in partnership with the FBI, and he implemented rigorous investigations and proper protocols while transforming the culture of that office. But here's the thing, Mr. Kim doesn't just have experience with Chicago's PAB, he also has experience with New York City's PAB, that's CCRB. He served as chief of investigations for CCRB, overseeing NYPD's use of force and abuse of authority investigations. He restructured the 110-member investigations division. He strategically executed a staff overhaul, and he spearheaded their training academy, which is that rigorous in-house staff training program designed to enhance investigation of police misconduct and police brutality cases. Mr. Kim also has worked as the chief architect of a process at Thresholds, which is a service provider for those with serious mental health issues and substance use disorders. So the takeaway from all, and that's just a tiny fraction of these people's biographies, the important piece here is that they have very, very deep, national level, broad experience in a whole bunch of issue areas. And SMK Consulting has worked and is working with police accountability boards across the country, including getting boards off the ground, trying to consult on people who are just trying to draft legislation. The PAB came into contact with SMK in the process of the New York State Bar Association's work on policing and racial justice. There was a whole task force for the New York State Bar Association that I served on as part of their civilian review board panel. And we asked Ms. Malik to testify before us, and hearing about an hour's worth of her testimony, talking about the challenges that New York City's PAB faced, how she was able to overcome them, and then help transform that agency. It was just remarkable kind of hearing about it. To be frank, Mina is kind of a legend in the field. And so being able to listen to her at the Bar Association was phenomenal. And so obviously we took a lot of her testimony and knowledge and put that into our report and recommendations up there. But I also wanted to make sure that I could gain as much knowledge as possible from Mina. And so that's how we got kind of connected together. We've had a number of conversations follow up talking about how can we get the PAB working. And I've already kind of stolen so much knowledge from Mina's head. And, what we've talked about is the work of SMK, the remarkable work they've been doing across the country. And so that's how I got connected to Professor Sullivan and Mr. Kim, and hearing from them, their work, their ideas. And, as they've learned more, I think, about the PAB in Rochester, our law, our potential, I think they're very excited and interested in getting involved in our work. And so I think the board has asked them to do a bit of a presentation on their work, their ideas, and how that might be brought to Rochester to help us do all the things we need to do to get started on that most important part of our work, perhaps investigating allegations of police misconduct fairly, quickly, and transparently. Now, I've done enough talking, and I really want to hand over the table to these folks. But please, I just want to thank everyone for being here, for taking their time and being willing to answer our questions, especially about our hope, the potential plan for us all working together. And so especially now I've got Rabbi Settle back into the meeting. Hopefully we can turn it over to you folks.
Thank you so much, Connor, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to thank Chair Wilson, Connor, and the rest of the board members, and congratulate you all for being the inaugural board members for the Rochester PAB. It's absolutely wonderful. And thank you very much for having us here tonight. We look forward to an hour-long or maybe 45-minute long discussion with you. And hopefully we can exchange ideas and help you build a gold standard for the entire country. When I was the executive director at the CCRB in New York City, I worked with Thomas. Thomas was my number 2 person there, and he was chief of investigations and essentially the deputy executive director. And I have to tell you, the CCRB at that point in time had been in existence for 22 years. It had been in existence. It was created separately from the New York City Police Department in 1993, even though it had existed way before then. But the issues that we found at the CCRB, even though it's the largest investigatory agency for police misconduct in the country and probably has the largest budget, is that it was not operating the way it should have been operating and did not live up to the reputation that it should have had as an independent, non-mayoral police oversight agency. And during my tenure there was a lot of police misconduct going on. We had the Freddie Gray case in Baltimore. In New York, I dealt with the Eric Garner case, Thabo Cephalosha, the Atlanta Hawks player who had his leg broken, and James Blake, the tennis pro, who was accosted and attacked outside of the Grand Hyatt near Grand Central Station in New York City. And we learned a lot basically from investigations, prosecutions, community outreach, the data collection analysis, and the transparency that was needed for the public to have confidence in the CCRB. I would like to say and think that we've improved the agency so much that it is now the national model and the gold standard in the country. And I think the only oversight agency that has prosecutorial powers to prosecute the police officers in an administrative court and in front of an administrative judge. But what I would like to say to you is you have an absolute unique opportunity in Rochester to bring a unique gold standard to the people of Rochester in your community. And you're starting from the ground up. I compare it to building a house. If you build a house out of straw or wood versus stone and steel, you're not going to have a strong foundation. And you have this opportunity that all of you can take on. You're giving your time, you're giving your energy, and you're giving your effort. And I'm so glad to have this conversation with you tonight. I want to help you all build the best police oversight agency in the entire country. And so I'm going to hand this over now to Thomas. Thomas has worked very diligently on doing some slides to share some information with you. And I'll let Thomas take it from here.
Oh, fantastic. So I'm going to run this slide, and I don't like to just read slides. So what I like to do is, this is our opening slide in terms of who we are. But what I do want to kind of, point out is what we will be covering tonight, and that is the aspect of what type of police accountability organizations exist and what building blocks are necessary for a robust and comprehensive and top of the line police accountability system and investigative agency that's needed in Rochester. But great news is, which we will get into, is that the building block at PAB in Rochester already appears to have been laid forth, is what we need to do to build on. So, and what we could offer to the Rochester PAB. So I think, you know, if I end up boring anybody, just biggest takeaway for tonight's presentation is do it right, put the right resource, energy, and staffing and budget at the front end. I see a number of organizations who want to build slowly as the cases are coming in. And then what happens is that then they could never catch up. Or as Ms. Malik had indicated, that it's really hard to go back after 20 plus years of certain way of doing things, and trying to correct it becomes very challenging. So build it right from the front end, put the time, resource, and hire the right folks and provide the right training. And that's the best way to do it. So, you know, what other organizations are out there, and how does it stack up to Rochester PAB's start or beginning? And I'm not going to go through one by one reading through, but there's various type of organizations out there. There's something along the line of about 140 police accountability organizations that exist in the United States. That is what I've recently read. So it could be more, it could be a few less, but it ranges from, for example, in Colorado Springs, where I still have a home there. They recently started what they call Law Enforcement Transparency and Accountability Commission. It sounds great, but really has no authority. But at least it is sanctioned by the city. It's a volunteer basis. But then there are other communities that actually don't even have city sanction or support it. So well-meaning citizens getting together to do something about it. And then there are those city sponsor, government sponsor organizations. Denver has Office of Independent Monitor, which means they really don't have full authority. They get to review investigation that's done through internal affairs. And then Seattle has a hybrid model where they're independent agency, but there is a separate police accountability board, along with Seattle's Office of Professional Accountability, where there are civilian investigators along with police sergeants who are assigned to investigate. And then LA has Office of Inspector General model, where they review patterns and practice, and then has an opportunity to review internal affairs investigation. But key thing is, and then there are a number of other cities, including one that's not too far from Rochester, has what they call advisory boards. Many advisory boards exist throughout the United States, really has no authority. And in terms of making recommendations, how much impact do they have is questionable. So what we'll be kind of looking at is independent agency that has investigative authority and disciplinary authority. So the great news is that Rochester PAB seems to have a good foundation. It is established as an independent agency led by great folks like you, Citizen Board, and has the ability to review and make policy recommendation, and is able to conduct, is given an authority to conduct independent investigation. So, and my understanding is that moving towards creating a disciplinary matrix, as the slide indicates, if there is the lawsuit is prevail, hopefully in the right way. But in terms of critical piece is that you already have a successful building block. And these are some of the things that we recommend. It's already built into the city charter. Truly independent agency, independent of political or even financial pressure. But just because it exists in charter doesn't mean those things will not occur. As Ms. Malik will state, at CCRB or my time in Chicago or state of Illinois, it's rarely an official pressure or influence, but it's those a subtle component of it, and it is absolutely critical for a success of investigative organization like PAB to resist and be able to stay independent, regardless of any type of subtle to overt to covert type of political or financial pressure associated with it. But good news is that there's already a city charter that exists. And second thing that we recommend is already built into city charter is the capacity to look at patterns and practice and make recommendations. And that was one of the things that Ms. Malik worked really hard to ensure that CCRB was producing those patterns and practice reviews and make recommendations. And that's how you're able to do a systems change. And then city charter at Rochester PAB already has this foundation, capacity to investigate allegations that could potentially be within the criminal as well as administrative. But one key aspect is that ensuring that DV type of cases, as well as potential violation of law, criminal law, needs to be independently investigated by a civilian oversight agency. It appears to have that as a city charter. And another aspect, disciplinary recommendation. My understanding is that city charter provides that for PAB. And that's tied to the disciplinary matrix. And that's something that Mina, Ms. Malik had worked so hard at CCRB to push forward in that capacity, and we recently saw that come to fruition in New York City. Few other aspects that already has a great foundation at Rochester PAB that already has the city charter built in. Aspect of community relations. CCRB was really under Ms. Malik's leadership, focus on building that relationship and then creating a transparent capacity associated with it, especially utilizing the data analytics so that citizens who make complaint could track their cases, and then also regular citizens could also understand and know where things were happening, where are the hotbeds, and so on. So, and if I were to say one of the most critical piece in having a successful police accountability and investigative agency is ability to access police document, not just based on city charter for the police department to provide those things within certain time frame, but be able to immediately access it if need be. That was one great thing that I experienced when I was in Chicago, where we really didn't need to wait on CPD, Chicago Police Department. We had direct access to it, including the body, camera images, as well as any type of city-owned, the surveillance system, camera system, shot spotters, for example. And part of the frustration I had at running an investigation in New York City was that even though city charter said they're supposed to provide these documents, oftentimes it didn't occur where it's supposed to. So this is absolutely critical, and a subpoena power, which PAB already has. So it is a great start. There's a great foundation, and there's an opportunity to make this a truly national and even international model because other countries are interested. But what else is needed to build a very successful, robust, and state-of-the-art national model police accountability entity? So obviously you have to start with highly qualified investigators. And I was great to hear that the Rochester PAB was looking to hire investigators who have a law degree. I'm not a lawyer. I wasn't smart enough to go to law school, but I think there's a huge advantage in hiring lawyers and then training them to be an investigator. And the training component, whether they're lawyers or not, is another critical piece, ensuring that there is a start of either 4 weeks, 5 weeks, or 6 weeks type of training at the front end, and then ensuring that yearly follow-up training, as well as the attrition occurs in the investigator rank, that new classes are put together and they're trained together as a class. You know, strangely enough, when we were looking at the models and so on, 1-to-20 ratio is something that we advocate. And reason for that is, if you want to complete investigation in a certain time frame, for example, 90 days, it is absolutely critical that 1 investigator to 20 expected annual complaints is critical ratio, because once you start to balloon that number or start with the smaller staff and trying to add as the complaints are coming in, you never are able to get to a point where you could catch up. So you have to ensure that investigators' full attention can be devoted to the cases they're working on. And I cannot emphasize this enough. Front load and invest in hiring at the front end rather than, well, we're not sure how many investigations or complaints are going to come in, so we're just going to start with small number, versus what does a budget indicate? Hire those folks, recruit them, vet them, hire them, put them into the right and robust training mechanism, and ensure they're ready to go. And this is not like some storefront where you could build additional personnel and on-the-job type of training. It never works out. An unfortunate reality was, I think, when Ms. Malik got to CCRB, that was one of the key components that was lacking. And one of the first tasks she had me do is look at the recruitment aspect, as well as ensuring that training academy is set up and that classes are set so that everyone goes through the training together. So, and then in terms of looking at, it's critical, especially if PAB, which I believe it is, are going to look at complex cases, to have a forensic expert in-house rather than waiting for external entities. You still have to work with crime labs and so on, but like, for example, at CCRB, we didn't have that, and we were in the process of building, but we always had to wait on, at the same time, also depend on NYPD. So we're an independent agency investigating police misconduct, but we're still dependent on the NYPD to provide those information. So it is critical to add that piece in there, especially digital evidence expert. So many of the cases and the rapid aspect of conclusion could occur if the right type of digital evidence technicians could be hired, who may also have cross-training in forensic aspect of it. PAB likely, and I don't believe there's any agency in the United States that actually has their own forensic lab. But when a state police lab conducts or is meeting with, for example, after a shooting case in Chicago, we will meet with the state police forensic lab team, and we will determine what we wanted tested, what we were deferring. So in order to do that, you need a forensic expert and build that into the budget as well. In terms of as well statute of limitation, there has to be certain determination so that things are not just completely open in terms of when SOL could expire. But at the same time, one of the things that I learned in different cities and other places is that even if the cases are closed, if there's a new evidence that comes up, ability to reopen investigation, or if there's a civil litigation in that process, new evidence is uncovered, then ability to reopen those investigation based on that. And as I've earlier talked about a few seconds ago, ability to build, even though it does not have in the city charter, it just requires a relationship, agreement, MOU. that's what was occurring in Chicago, even though there was a thought of building its own department, but they did hire a forensic specialist, but still state police are the ones who's conducting those ballistic to blood trace to any type of forensic evidence analysis. But it's absolutely critical for investigator as well as a forensic expert to be at the meeting and say what and why we want a certain things tested, and then following up on those things. And aspect of other ways to resolve a case. My understanding is there's no explicit charter related within Rochester PAB. But Ms. Mina could talk a little bit more about mediation unit and her decision to really put a lot of resource in CCRB. But it also had some very, very good results among the civilians as well as the officers. And I think if I remember correctly, certain cases would not be qualified for mediation because use of force was not eligible for mediation. And then if the officer was coming back on either second or third mediation, they were not eligible. Maybe Ms. Malik could step in and kind of jar my memory in terms of mediation aspect of it.
Oh, that's absolutely right. The more serious cases were not eligible for mediation. And, restorative justice is another component that can be added. We had a mediation unit at the CCRB. Restorative justice, I worked with restorative justice facilitators when I was Deputy Attorney General in DC. And that's basically bringing the offender and the person who was offended together. Both of them have to agree that they want to go the restorative justice route. And they sit down and they try and talk about the incident. The offender talks about why he or she did the acts that he or she did. And the person who was offended talks about how it made them feel and what the outcome was. And hopefully they come to some sort of resolution, and they've signed off. Sometimes they've even signed off on agreements going forward. So mediation and restorative justice can be very meaningful tools to use in police accountability because there are different ways of holding officers accountable. Sometimes what you want to accomplish is that there is some sort of resolution, right, between the officer and the person who was wronged. And it doesn't always mean, termination. It doesn't always mean suspension. Sometimes it can be worked out, but those are relatively on the safer side for the more minor offenses.
Did I lose Ms. Malik?
No, I'm still here.
Okay. All right. All right. So, mediation and restorative justice is absolutely a critical piece of it. And this is another point in terms of working with other law enforcement, and people get confused. And that is, wait a second, I thought this was a civilian oversight agency. What is the need for? Because sometimes that investigation as it starts, like for example, on officer involved death, OID type of cases, or officer involved shooting cases, there's always potential for criminal violation. So it was absolutely critical that, for example, the entity in Chicago, as well as entity in Seattle as well, that ability to have what they call clean team and dirty team, administrative investigators, and then ones who potentially maybe looking at criminal investigation, and keeping those teams separate, and so that if it needs to actually be presented to grand jury or to hand off to state's attorney or district attorney, that it could be done. So in terms of collaboration and partnership, for example, there was one particular shooting case, Jose Nieves case. I could mention it because it's a public in nature, that we, Chicago Civilian Office of Professional Accountability, went out to the scene, took over the scene, and started the investigation. But immediately we knew something was not right. So from that point, that our, call it a clean team, were able to gather enough evidence and meet with the state attorney's office and started preparation for a transfer that case over for them to build and prosecute the case. Conclusion was that he was charged with murder, officer was, and then outcome, you could Google it and it'll show that officer, I believe, was convicted. And then on that particular case, we also had to work with federal authority as well. There were a number of cases that we worked with FBI in terms of what they were looking at in terms of civil rights violation. And there were a number of cases that 4 entities were involved: Office of Inspector General of the city, as well as police oversight, investigation. And usually it involved excessive use of force, shooting cases, or officer-involved death cases, where OIG was investigating certain aspect of it. This one I cannot mention, but it also involved a staffing issue or staff misconduct, so OIG was involved in that. And then FBI was involved in certain other aspect of that investigation. And then we also had to meet with the state attorney investigators to package it. And then we had to look at what we could transmit over to ensure that we were not sending over to state attorney some of the compelled testimony from the administrative side, even though we had a walled off team or cleaner or dirty team. So it's absolutely critical to build those relationships in case or some of those cases are being investigated as criminal act. So I would have to say, as we started that, many of those cases sunsetted because it came to realization there was no criminal wrongdoing, but administrative cases continued on to see whether there was a policy violation. So, and that could result in disciplinary actions. Other, components associated with it is, if you don't have the right people, you're not going to get the right results. So, I just have to chuckle because Miss Mina used to put a new investigator during the interview through a ringer. So they're all excited, graduated from top schools and so on. But boy, I was thinking, boy, how did I get through to get hired by her? So, but it is absolutely important to recruit and then interview and vet them properly, and then putting them through a robust, extensive, competency-based investigation training that has a clear academy process where training manuals are there. And other components are, you have to have investigative manual to have a consistent process and what I call SOP, policy and procedures. And in terms of what the legal component or the research database they're able to access. In New York City, we use CLEAR, and then and we had a number of other resources that was available. Same thing in Chicago. Seattle has the same thing. And then preparing them for right procedural hearing process. But at CCRB, maybe Miss Mina, Mina could speak a little bit more, but we had kind of like our own review process where investigator will be put on a hot seat with the supervisor and then face a panel and essentially almost like presenting a case, and then we will try to poke holes on it so that when it goes to administrative hearing or trial, that we had a solid case. When our prosecution unit was taking the case moving forward, they had a solid case. And when other civilian attorneys or the police union attorneys were looking at it, we had a solid case. I forgot what we call that process, but it was very stressful for investigators and supervisors and some attorneys as well, but it made the cases much more stronger so that when they're ready to present to the board, it was very, very good case. Do you remember what you called it, Ms. Mina?
Is that CCRB stat?
Yeah, that's right.
or case review?
Case review, and I have to admit there were times that investigator would call in sick when it was their turn to, especially when they realize, oh, I don't know whether I did everything correctly. It wasn't about to embarrass the investigator, attorneys, or supervisor. It was to make sure that, hey, if we haven't explored things, let's look at it. Let's send it back and put more resource and time into it. And actually, I learned that at CCRB. I took that to Chicago and utilized the same process. And having an SOP or standard operating procedure is absolutely critical. And I think it appears that we have a wonderful civilian oversight board, but the board training on the process and procedure is critical as well. And once again, disciplinary matrix, so that right investigation, right evidentiary component of it, taking a look at all of the components of interview process, evidence that's gathered through digital, video, audio, to forensic, results in right outcome. And then based on that and the act that occurred, where does that fall in terms of what the disciplinary process should be? Ideal model, somewhat similar to what we had at CCRB in New York, somewhat similar to what we had in Chicago as well, that in CCRB and major case teams, so we had squad bases. I think we had 18 different squads, but senior investigators were responsible for some of those most difficult or challenging cases. In Chicago, we had a similar squad model, but we had actual major case team, and they were specially trained to investigate officer-involved deaths and shooting cases and serious bodily injury type of cases, as well as serious domestic violence type of cases. So they went through the same academy, but they were given additional training in collaboration with FBI, so that one, the criticism from the union and others that, what do they know about shooting cases? Well, a lot of them had good experience prior to coming on board, but we brought in a homicide training team who will provide training to other police departments and law enforcement entity as well. And that training was in collaboration, like I said, with FBI. So forensics, mediation, and you could see this aspect of it, and then case management system. And at CCRB, obviously it was run by Ms. Malik, and I had an investigative oversight, and then we had a chief prosecutor overseeing that component of it, very similar to what we had in Chicago and very similar to Seattle as well.
If I could just jump in here also with respect to the major case team and the forensics team, I just want to point out how important it is to have specially trained investigators and people who can do this type of work. So the Eric Garner case, which came to the CCRB in New York, that case obviously involved asphyxiation, right? It involved a chokehold. And when we started investigating it, it was assigned to 2 investigators. Unfortunately, the 2 investigators who were assigned had no experience whatsoever with asphyxiation cases. And I came to learn that actually no investigator in the entire agency had any experience as to what to look for in terms of injuries to the neck. So I took it upon myself, having done domestic violence cases and other types of asphyxiation cases, death cases, I took it upon myself to go with the 2 investigators to interview the medical examiner and talk about all the injuries that Eric Garner had to his neck that were layers deep in the neck, and petechial hemorrhaging, which is what you look for when somebody is being strangled. So the reason why that was so important is because I don't know that anyone would have gone to talk to the medical examiner and find out all the intricacies and all the details of what happened to Eric Garner if I hadn't done that. And as you probably know, what happened in the Eric Garner case was very important because the Staten Island DA's office failed to get an indictment in that case. The federal government failed to prosecute that case. And the only avenue of justice that was left for Eric Garner was the CCRB. And the CCRB was the only entity that took that case to trial, where the officer was found guilty. And although it wasn't a criminal trial, he was terminated from the police department.
And that speaks volume in terms of right training and ongoing training and major case team and forensics team. And that is, it's unfortunately the Staten Island DA's office as well as federal team missed a boat. And wish that CCRB process was criminal in nature, because I think we had enough evidence. And same thing in Chicago as well. When Chicago team showed up at, for example, officer involved death cases or shooting case, then we would take over the scene from the CPD. They would secure the scene and it became our scene. But if we didn't have the right training, you would walk through potential evidence. So how do you approach a shooting scene? And what's the pattern you need to develop in looking at it? And how do we collect or observe the team that's collecting evidence? So those are absolutely critical. And I don't think it was published, but I remember distinctly January 1st shooting case in a number of years ago, and I believe it was 214 because I was awakened. And I ended up going to the scene along with my deputy chiefs and others, and the street commander briefed us and saying that, this was what they call wolf pack, and saw this person driving away, and they pinned him, and next thing you know, he stepped out what appeared to be a weapon, and they opened fire. So, all right, sounds good. But my investigator said, "Hey, chief, we need to investigate this." The gentleman was shot like 7 times, survived. So we had our investigator go to the hospital to make sure that nothing shenanigan was happening. So, waiting for potential to interview. But it was immediately clear because there was no shell casing around the vehicle. Shell casing pattern is irregular, so you cannot really make a good determination. But any junior high investigator could tell that, wait a second, that's what we were told by street commander as we're taking over the case. Looked inside the car, all of the shell casings were inside the vehicle, which meant the person was shot inside the vehicle and the police officer reached in and opened fire. So that's a simple way and simple case, but they're a lot more complex in terms of blood splatter. And having those type of training at the front end and having an expert forensic team providing those aspects in the investigation is absolutely critical, whether it's a death-related case or serious injury type of cases. So I cannot speak more forcefully in terms of type of entity that's needed and expertise that's needed, especially for Rochester PAB to become national standard and model.
May I ask a question before we, can we ask questions as we go?
Dr. Harvey, it's a little hard to hear you, Rev.
I don't know what to do to get, can you hear me now? I'm just asking, could I ask a question?
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask a question about the ideal organizational components for the PAB's investigations unit. You mentioned that there are approximately 140 accountability organizations in the United States. And I'm just wondering how many of the 140 accountability organizations are operating currently with the ideal organizational components?
So I didn't look into all 140, but majority are what we call advisory board. But what I do know is that CCRB does have major case team component of it within the each squad, senior investigator that had built a evidence collection team that was actually under Ms. Malik's leadership. And then also in Chicago, actually has a capacity to investigate, and every shooting cases are investigated by Civilian Oversight Authority in Chicago. So they're the one who manages and releases, including body-worn camera aspect of it. So they are the lead investigating agency on all officer-involved death cases. So they do have forensics team and major team who's trained in homicide aspect of it. One thing they don't have is mediation aspect built in, but they do have intake case management. They do have legal team. And then Seattle model is a little bit unique, but they do have trained investigators, major case team, and they do robust investigation. So in terms of overall picture, there's very few. And I think that's part of the problem that we face as a nation, because everybody wants to build a oversight entity, but they don't have teeth, they don't have the capacity, they don't have the budget, they don't have the investigator, they don't have the authority. So, so more isn't better, but doing it right, in my opinion, is the way to go. And I think Rochester has an opportunity here.
So a follow-up, and I'll be done. A follow-up is, how old is, what's the age of Chicago's accountability board, and what's the age of Seattle's accountability organization?
You mean the when they were started, or the board members, or?
Yeah, how long has the accountability board for each city been in existence?
So Seattle they do have civilian accountability or commission, but it's not really a board aspect of it. They're part of the city investigative authority, where they work with law enforcement or uniform officers along with civilian investigators. So that's a little bit different. And Chicago had multiple iterations. So I believe Chicago's model goes back to 90s, and then it used to be called the Office of Professional Conduct, spun off of Internal Affairs, where Internal Affairs only does a administrative aspect of it. And then after the Laquan McDonald shooting, and that resulted in essentially ending up in Chicago. That resulted in that IPRA at that time, which came off of Office of Professional Conduct, became its next iteration, and then there were criticism that they were in back pocket of CPD, and they were really more of defenders of CPD. So that got essentially sunsetted off, and the new Civilian Office of Professional Accountability started. So the COPA, or Civilian Office of Professional Accountability, is probably about 3 years old in terms of inception, if I remember correctly. And then prior to that was IPRA, and prior to that, but in terms of current structure and current organization, is about 3 years old. CCRB is the nation's oldest. And Ms. Malik will know that history really, really well. But also there's a lessons learned, and that is, if you don't do it right from the get-go and does not have the authority and resource at the front end, it's really, really hard to fix it at the back end.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Kim. So folks, I'd really just like to save our questions for the end of their presentation, because I'm sure we all have quite a few. So thank you so much.
And then in terms of what we could provide, Professor Sullivan will speak more into that.
Thank you. Let me ask the chair, I just want to do a time check, because I do want to be sure that we've got enough time to answer any questions that the board has.
Okay, so we have, I think we said 45 minutes to an hour, so please go ahead and take as much time as you need.
Okay, thanks. So in the end, and I'll be very brief because we really want to hear what's on your mind. In the end, collectively, our group has experience with respect to a wide range of models. So many that we can see around virtually every corner in terms of what this group, PAB, may experience. We also have enough experience with models to know that, there's no sort of cookie cutter model that you can wholesale import into a given jurisdiction, but rather we take the best practices from all over the country and think about the ways in which it will work in a particular jurisdiction, given that jurisdiction structure, given its ambitions and so forth. So in terms of more specifically what we can provide, I'll just quickly go through the bullets. In terms of procedural rules that must be in place before investigations begin, Thomas already talked about the disciplinary matrix that I understand is already in development, but you don't want to do this sort of thing ad hoc, and we can help to develop a set of rules that helps guide, that will help guide decisions. Framework for recruiting, vetting, and training investigators, absolutely essential for the reasons that Thomas mentioned earlier, but we do trainings across the country at prosecutors' offices, at CCRB offices, et cetera, at defense offices, but we do a lot of training of investigators. Manuals and SOPs, I mean, these are the things that we can certainly help to develop and be sure that we put in what's necessary to ensure that there are no problems down the line. Also, Thomas talked about this a bit as well, the training academy material. So what's the substance of how we are able to train? I don't want to just read to you, but so you can see the list here. There are techniques tried and true that we've seen done well and that we've seen done poorly across the country. What we want to do is bring to PAB the things that are done well. So in the middle of the list, interview processes and techniques. There is an art and science to interviewing, and with dedicated study and effort, people can be trained to do it well. If left to their own devices, the likelihood is that it will be done moderately or, God forbid, poorly. But there are techniques that we can bring to help maximize what you get out of investigators. For example, report writing and case preparation, essential. There is a record that's going to be made that can be used either affirmatively or to the detriment of the agency, and how you draft these reports, et cetera, are absolutely essential. So with respect to this list here, we can provide either training or create the manuals as necessary. And here, and this is our final slide, and I'm moving quickly so that we can so we can take questions. So I'll let you look at it as I'm talking. Again, I don't want to just read this to you, but by way of example, the case intake process and rapid response manual. Once again, how these matters come in, how they are vetted, and the manner in which the investigative team handles these will determine to a great extent whether the outcome will be favorable. And favorable, I mean the right result given the facts, right? I mean, some things may move to a criminal adjudication, but some things may not. It's not the point is not for the PAB to be an advocacy organization, obviously, but the point is to get it right and make sure that that police are complying both with law and policy. Use of force investigation. Again, the nation learned, and for many for the first time, that use of force is actually constrained in a continuum, and every jurisdiction has particular guidelines with respect to use of force. But one of the things that the nation learned with the George Floyd trial was that all of that comes under the rubric of a Supreme Court hearing, which sets a constitutional floor that no one can go below. So use of force investigation is a substantive training with respect to the law, constitutional law, federal law, but also the local instantiation of that law, the way the local law uses the federal floor in order to set its force continuum. We have all of that information. We can teach all of that information. We can put it into a manual. And with the rest of this, and finally, the last one, the case presentation to the board, again by way of example. These processes and what we do around the country is help bring these processes to the most favorable or to the most efficacious light, the most effective light. So the point is to present to people who weren't at a situation, who did not witness a situation, to present to them information as though they were there, with enough specificity, with the language. I call them word pictures, to create word pictures such that people understand what happened. And when you're presenting a case, there is an art and a science, as I said, with investigation, to presenting a case in a manner that is most effective. Otherwise, things slip through the cracks because something gets lost in the presentation, such that what happened on the ground is not adequately presented to the board in a way that the board understands it, so that the board can exercise its wise discretion to make to make a decision. So the point here is to engage in training that helps them make that presentation in a way that's most effective. So I'm going to stop there and I think open the floor for questions. And Mina is going to be the lead responder to questions, as she was the boss in one of these institutes. But Thomas and I are available to pipe in as necessary.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. I think one of the things I'm left with is just how detailed and how intricate these review boards are. And I'm sure that the people, we are watching thinking the same thing. I hope we are. And also the people that are watching on Facebook, like Facebook is kind of really asking a lot of questions. So I think I'll start. So I guess the first question that I have is, I actually will take it from the Facebook chat, because I think it's a great question. What are the budgets that you all were working with for some of these oversight entities? So I thought that was a great question to start with.
So I can speak to the CCRB, and when I was executive director there, we had about 200 employees and a budget of $16.5 million. And it actually went up during the time, the budget went up and increased during the time that I was there. I think right now, currently, it's probably at about 20 million. And Thomas, you would know about Chicago.
Yeah, I believe it was somewhere in the 12, 13 million, but it was a smaller entity because NYPD at the time had 38,000, I believe, uniform officers, whereas Chicago has a lot fewer. But in terms of comparative budget-wise, it was a little bit higher because we were able to add additional specialty associated with, and it was in the wake of the Laquan McDonald shooting. So there were more willingness to invest in the new entity. So,
okay, thank you, Board Member Perez.
Thank you again for that presentation, and budget was going to be one of my questions, but I have another question. We recently had a presentation by a retired officer, and one of the things that he mentioned that he said that we needed to really consider was the officers within, and how sometimes they're afraid he actually compared it to a domestic violence situation where people are afraid to speak up and testify or even address colleagues that may be doing behaviors that are not appropriate. How did you guys handle those situations within the organizations that you led?
So in terms of my experience, there are a number of cases that I could remember, but one unique thing about PAB is that its ability to investigate without complaints. So as a situation arises, you don't need a complainant. But in terms of officer ranks and getting testimony from officers is always a challenge. And at CCRB, there was one particular situation. Actually, it was out of Staten Island during one of the demonstration. That no, actually, it was one of the holiday event. The gentleman who was very drunk. May have said some choice words to a police officer, and he was severely beat up in back of the ambulance. I think Ms. Malik will remember that. And the case came through anonymous report from NYPD officer. And in order for us to track him down, it took us quite a bit of effort because there was a fear that that officer would get himself in trouble because he just saw that and realized this is not right. So made a report and investigation started. It took a lot of effort in terms of looking at the roll call to, who was at the scene. And then we ultimately determined that it was certain officer who was temporarily assigned to that precinct. And eventually that officer did say, yeah. And then the problem was, and it was really hard for us to get testimony out of him. Even to validate that what he had supplied with the information. So, but good news is this, that on an administrative investigation, you have right for compelled testimony, right? So at the threat of losing their job. However, that information cannot cross over on a criminal investigation side. So there's always that barrier associated with it. But same thing in Chicago, and I believe in Seattle and other places as well. But on a major cases, so it's imperative that when you get to the scene, that you're able to interview the officer who's involved. And obviously you have to navigate through the collective bargaining aspect of when that officer could be interviewed, but ensuring that time frame does not occur where they're actually trying to match up the story. So that's absolutely critical. And oftentimes on a shooting type of cases, our investigator will go, one, collecting the weapon on the scene, and then proper the transfer of it, and then going to the station to interview the officer in given allotted time with the collective bargaining agreement, and then following up with interviewing other witness officers as well. So those are mechanisms that you have to have. Once again, it goes back to proper training and a manual and process. So the investigators know. And then also interviewing civilian witnesses. And then you go back to see whether what they have said initially, whether they had a lapse in judgment related to what they reported, giving them opportunity to add additional information or provide new information associated with it. So there oftentimes were multiple officer interview with the same officer as the new evidence came up.
My apologies.
So my Siri was, I don't know why it was doing that. Everyone's listening, right? So in terms of, even if the officer at the scene does not want to testify on an administrative case, it's a compelled testimony, one, right? And then on potential criminal case, there are other mechanisms to obtain through evidence collection. And good news is that everybody has a cell phone these days. So somebody has something, and how quickly are you able to get to that and collect that effectively is absolutely, absolutely critical.
Dr. Harrison.
Thank you. I hope this is an appropriate question, but Ms. Malik, are you all a formal organization or partnership?
Yes, we are.
So what's the name?
SMK Consulting.
And could you name 2 or 3 boards that you are presently working with?
Yes, absolutely. I'm actually on the board for the Primo Center for Women and Children in Chicago. And
I'm talking about police boards now.
oh, police boards.
PABs, other PABs.
Oh, sorry. I thought you meant regular boards.
I was impressed.
I was coming up with the whole laundry list of boards that I work with right now. Well, Thomas can speak to the boards that we have consulted with, and the ones that we are currently working with. We're actually working with the Circuit Attorney's Office out in the St. Louis, and we are doing a lot of training for their investigators as well as their attorneys in terms of prosecuting cases. And it's a very involved process. We've been working with them for a very long time. And I'm sure that Ms. Gardner would be happy to speak with you about our knowledge and our expertise.
Because in that St. Louis Circuit Attorney's Office, they don't have a separate independent police board or investigative authority, but they are essentially the guardian related to officer involved type of use of force investigation. Ms. Malik has, and we have actually connected with and providing, guidance at the onset, whether we were at CCRB or not, in terms of new board that were being started, and in terms of relationship, provided opportunity in terms of in Seattle, and then Colorado Springs in terms of my work as well, but in terms of direct experience aspect of it, 2 major cities that what we have done, and then current in terms of providing what I call more of advisory information, because we get pinged a lot in terms of our knowledge and resource, but it's important to pick the right type of entity that we want to support. So, and I think based on, I don't think I was on that call, but it appears that Rochester, the charter uniquely is set up in a position to cover all of the bases that we're talking about. So
Thank you very much.
Board Member Brown.
Good evening again, and thank you so much for the very informative presentation. My question is this: in assisting Rochester in reimagining safety, I'd like to ask if you all have any information about how to work with changing the culture. It's one thing to have manuals and everybody trained, but if we don't affect how the officers who are currently working and or to be hired think about the people that they are policing, and also how to help the community see differently the police officers, and that we're all here for the same thing, that we want safe citizens. We want to be able to trust one another to get the work done. Would you be kind enough to address some of that, please?
I think that is the absolute right question, and goes to the crux of what's one of the major problems. We have it somewhere in the material here, but part of our approach in any of these organizations is what we call ethos. So our strong view is dovetails with your question. Our strong view is that architecture alone is an insufficient scaffolding to hold up this thing. that there has to be a change of ethos in order for the structure to work. You need the structure. And I won't back away from that. You need the structure, but that alone is not sufficient. You have to have the ethos. So your question was sort of in two parts. One was internal, and then one was external with the police and so forth. With the internal part, it all has to do with messaging. And one of the things, if we were to come aboard and work with you all, is we would get to know the organization and the people who work in the organization, and we would advise with respect to language, which goes to messaging, and that helps change the ethos. By way of very quick example, when we did the Brooklyn piece years ago, we were essentially being asked to go into a prosecutor's office before this idea of progressive prosecution was even a thing, to go in and ask prosecutors to get people out of jail, and that was just foreign. So one of the things that I suggested to Ken Thompson was that every time you open your mouth in a big congregate setting, you say something about prosecutors being ministers of justice. And slowly but surely, the idea was to help integrate this ethos into the office, that there is more than convictions, but you are a minister of justice. And that helps socialize the group to this notion that, oh, it's consistent with our duty to help get people out of jail. I could go longer with that example. I just want to give you one tangible thing to sort of give you a sense of how we would approach it. Now, externally, what we have, there was I've got it up here somewhere. Just recently, a law professor wrote a book. She left her law professorship and went to the police academy at like 43. And graduated the police academy and had served as a police officer, and then wrote a book about the experience. The professor's name is Rosa Brooks, and the name of the book is something in blue. I just forget the name of it right now.
Up in blue.
What is it?
Tangled Up in Blue.
Tangled Up in Blue. Fascinating book. One of the things we learned is that the culture of policing is such that they're taught from the academy on up to view every interaction as a potential life-threatening interaction to them. And then that motivates the way they behave and the way they see fellow citizens. Couple that with a much more broader societal view that color is a proxy for criminality, and it's a dangerous, dangerous mix. So you're absolutely right. That has to be changed too. That may be, this organization may have a role in that, but that's an even broader issue, and others have to get involved in that too, to sort of change the ethos within the police community in order to change the nature of the interactions between police and citizens. You also mentioned the reciprocal of that, how citizens view police, and how, it's not going to work if we continue to live in a situation where citizens feel just in mortal danger for a police interaction. There's something wrong with that. And, even I, as a Harvard professor, life appointment and all of that, I still get that knot in my chest if I see a police officer behind me. That's a situation that simply is not tenable, and it really. So I think what will change it is changing the culture of how police are trained, and one way to do that, and the way that this board can be effective in that, is to the degree people are held accountable for misbehavior, then that acts as a general deterrent to other police officers. And if enough of that general deterrent begins to spread around the force, then that should seep into the training of police officers, so it will incent the department to train in a way such that they won't find themselves on the wrong side of a decision. So, that second part is a harder and broader question, but I absolutely agree with you that it's essential that we continue to think about it. But what I articulated would be the way that we would approach it.
And if I were to just piggyback real quick, is that as Professor Sullivan had pointed out, so in terms of community aspect of it, this is why it's critical for PAB to also have an outreach program in the community. And that's something that CCRB in New York was establishing to educate and what their rights are, and in terms of police interaction. And then in terms of police behavior change, there's another aspect of patterns and practice investigation to see where is the gap and how do we make a policy change implementation for the police department as well. And just as that author had indicated, it's the aspect of how police are trained and then perpetuate that fear and belief. So accountability is one piece of it, and then patterns and practice reviewing and recommended policy and training change is another, and then outreach program with the community aspect of it is another piece as well. All has to be done simultaneously.
Thank you so much. So I just wanted to ask a question about, you guys have talked about, authority issues and what that looked like as far as all the experience that you all have had. And I think one of the things I was wondering about is external pressure and, the fight to stay separate from politics. And, I'd really like to hear about your individual experiences with that. And then how, and I also wanted to do two things, like how independence plays a role in keeping separate from external pressure and how important that is, and if it's important. And then the second thing is, I think that there seems to be a disconnect or a misunderstanding happening between government and entity about what the actual nature of these police accountability boards, what they can do, especially ours. And, how did you encounter educating or working with city government officials that really felt that one, the PAB is supposed to do this thing rather than another? So like, how did you educate them and how did that work out? So kind of I hope my question was clear enough. There's a lot to ask, as you can tell. There's so many questions.
Absolutely, Chair Wilson, but great questions. And I'll start with the independence.
Can I just add a little bit to that? I'm sorry, just to add on to it, just that we hear from a lot of people, because this is true of the community too. We want you to hear cases, and they don't understand the necessity of doing the other pieces of why do we have to do this policy procedure stuff or whatever. So to me, that's part of the question. Sorry.
So with respect to the independence part of your question, I think independence is absolutely critical. It's absolutely critical. And, when you talk about an agency being independent or non-mayoral, right, it's basically a standalone agency that really is there to serve the public and the public alone. And that should be the goal and the mission of the agency. It shouldn't be placating City Hall. It shouldn't be placating whatever police department. It shouldn't be placating police unions. It should be an independent agency that can do the job that it is mandated to do. And so it is definitely critical. I liken police review boards or police accountability boards or CRBs to a district attorney's office, quite frankly, right? Even though it's a different, it's not criminal, it still is an agency that is designed to hold people accountable for their misconduct. So do district attorneys' offices normally placate the executive branch of government? Do they normally placate, another entity? Sometimes they do, but you would like to think that elected official that the people have voted into office are there to serve the people of the county in which they were voted in. And so that's very, very critical, the independence part. In terms of working with other government partners, I was a firm believer in reaching across the aisles and welcoming other people, heads of police unions, heads at the NYPD into our office. Actually, all of the police union heads with whom we met said that it was the first time that they had ever been invited to have a meeting with the head of the Civilian Complaint Review Board. And even though we have very different jobs, right, I made clear to them that I was there to do a job and I was going to be fair and impartial to their officers in the investigations and the prosecutions that we handled. But I was going to also serve the public and give the public the justice that it needed, as well as their officers. At the end of the day, we called it as we saw it. We were fair, we were impartial. That's what we trained our investigators and our prosecutors to be. And that, I think, is, a sign of a successful agency when you can do that.
So I just wanted to add on, because I wanted to make sure that I made sure that this question got answered, if it could be. Just about interpretation of the law or the charter or any other, like about how we're supposed to be doing our jobs. Because I think that that's also something that really, is it education? Like, is it more discussion about the legality of what PABs can do that government officials or the public had problems understanding, and how did you all address that?
I think Ms. Malik could speak to in terms of outreach program, because that was a big effort in terms of educating the public component of it, so that there is no misunderstanding. For example, a certain group may think that CCRB or Police Accountability is an advocacy group. In reality, no, it's a fact-finding group. So at least on my end, running joke that I had with my team was, if one day certain political elected officials love you, and the next day they hate you, and then one day police union think that you guys are finally doing your job, and the next day think that you guys are the most evil thing. And unfortunately, some days certain community thinks that you're just supporting cops, and the next day think that finally we're getting justice. Then we may be doing the right thing because we're looking at what the evidence is telling us, rather than, well, we have to make a decision based on political or community pressure. And it's really difficult job, and it's stressful, but it's needed. And to answer Rabbi's question in terms of the political and external and pressure component of it, that the head of the organization must be protected, in a sense that just because political entities or people don't like that person, so let's get rid of them or get rid of her and bring somebody else in. But in terms of, it's absolutely critical to create an educational piece for the community elected officials, what the boundaries, four corners that PABs can and is authorized to operate. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult to navigate through.
Anybody else have any questions? All right, well, I do. So anyway, so how long does it take usually on average for you all to establish, or with some of the folks you've been working with? I know in an advisory role, but how long does it take in order for you to see these PABs well established?
Do you want to take that, Mina, or New York was revamping, so go ahead.
New York was an entire revamp of the agency. So as I said in my opening statement, when you have an agency that's been operating for 22 years, and there are so many different aspects of the house that was built that needed to be fixed, it can take quite a while. It's not like starting from scratch, right? And you don't want to just plug the holes and fill them in, right? You want to replace the beams and try and get a stronger foundation. So it's really dependent on, if there is an existing organization that needs an overhaul, or whether you're starting from scratch. I would like to think that when you're starting from scratch, since you have a blank canvas, that it is easier to do than going into a house that's already been built and doing a gut renovation.
So in Chicago, if you were to isolate in terms of union issue and in essence, the previous investigator from IPRA had reapplied. So that became a union contention in terms of potential for litigations and so on. If you take that out and moving through the interview process, recruitment and interview process and training, I would say it was about a year because it was a brand new startup. So.
Okay. Okay, Reverend Nikoloff.
So back to the question of independence really briefly, we found a lot of conflict around interpretation of the law, around interpretation of our powers, around entities believing how much of the law maybe that they're supposed to have following, maybe wondering if we're interpreting it correctly, et cetera, et cetera. I'm wondering, is this amount of conflict something you've seen in other with city entities, this kind of growing pains? Is this something you see often with police accountability boards and the city government, not just the mayor, but also this, like say city council or other entities, HR, et cetera? And if so, and when, how do you all help mitigate and mediate this, if at all? How do you advise boards in those situations, particularly when it seems like those entities are not wholeheartedly following the legislation?
Right. So I'm sure the legal eagle, Professor Sullivan, can chime in on the legal aspect of it. But I would say we had the perfect example of that was something under the CCRB's mandate and their jurisdiction. So for CCRB, we covered use of force, abuse of authority, discourtesy, and offensive language. Abuse of authority, to me, that is very broad. And when I was executive director, I said, you know what? How come sexual harassment or cases involving sexual misconduct or sexual assault by officers on civilians don't fall under abuse of authority? Where, say, for example, you have a woman who was stopped during a traffic stop by a police officer late at night. He tells her to get out of the car and sexually assaults her. Is that not considered an abuse of authority? There was a lot of pushback when I first had someone who specializes in this field and who could talk about anecdotally the number of cases where officers had sexually assaulted or sexually harassed civilian witnesses. And she testified for us at a board meeting. And I pushed for having abuse of authority cover sexual harassment and assault type of allegations. That didn't come to fruition until recently. So under the current chair, they finally did at least sexual harassment, and I think they're working on sexual assault. So it's something that can certainly be worked on. And, you have to have the right allies, obviously, in city government, and you have to make the right arguments. But if you have something so broad as abuse of authority, I think those arguments are sound.
And I'll just jump in briefly. It's not unique. Yes, you see it all over the country with respect to these sorts of arguments on scope of the enabling legislation. And that's natural in the sense that oftentimes police agencies want to view it more narrowly, and the agency itself wants to view it more broadly. But the way to deal with that is twofold. One, for any agency, not just this one, but for any independent agency within a state, there has to be someone internal, general counsel, something like that, internal, who makes the initial decision in terms of the scope of the authority, right? And then if that gets tested, ultimately a court will decide. But one of the things that we can bring to the table is help analyze the scope, because I think I've looked at every law across the country and what courts have said about it and so forth. So we could, at some level, legal realism wins the day and the law is whatever the judge says it is. But we could give you a pretty good guess of what a judge will say with respect to scope.
Rabbi Settle.
I'm wondering if you could just say a little more about how you would go about working with us. If we, agree to do that, what happens then, and how much you involved with the board as opposed to the staff?
So that's a great question, Rabbi. I think what's important is having a meeting of the minds as to exactly what the board is looking for in terms of, policy, procedure manuals, standard operating procedures, investigative manuals, training, all of these types of things that we've talked about earlier tonight, and really sort of tailoring that to what Rochester needs, right? What your police accountability board needs for itself in order to ensure success. And certainly, I think that it's very important to work across the board, right? Not only with the board members themselves, but obviously with the executive director, certainly, and the staff. And, to the extent of how much we work with any of those three entities, that's, I think, a decision that's best left for all of you to decide.
Thanks.
Dr. Harvey.
So I'm still with this ideal components piece and moving forward. And I'm wondering, can we move effectively without the ideal components? Or do we get as many of the components as possible now? And with us not having those ideal components in place, how do you recommend that we serve our community at present?
My recommendation would be try to build ideal component or get much as possible. But if that's not viable at the front end, then have a plan to incorporate that at some juncture. Rather than, pieces related to certain aspect, hearings team, major case, or mediation, for example, that's not possible. So it's never going to happen versus maybe not now, but let's focus on getting great investigators and process in place, getting them trained up so that they're meeting the benchmark of 90 days. And as that demonstration of effectiveness grows, that argument could be made to add these additional pieces into it. But answer will be, if there is a possibility, then it'll be great to try to get much as possible at the front end. As I've said, trying to build at the back end as a slow crawl becomes a little bit more challenging.
And if I could just add on to that, Dr. Harvey, our general approach, and I'm just going to abstract Thomas's answer a little bit, is that, we obviously want the Rolls-Royce model. Sometimes there are constraints, economic constraints, principally economic constraints. Sometimes there are legislative constraints. We'll deal with those constraints, but with the knowledge of having an ideal 100% Rolls-Royce model ideal in view. So one of the things we'd be able to say is, given the particular structure, this is the most effective way to move forward. However, keep in mind these two things that we're going to want to advocate for in the future, because it's going to make aspect one or aspect two much more effective. So always keep those things that you don't have in mind and not sort of get comfortable with the status quo, but rather work with what you have, but also be thinking about a mechanism to improve areas where there may be a deficit.
Board Member Tucker.
Mr. Sullivan actually just elaborated a little bit more. I was going to ask him to elaborate on that, and you did, so thank you for that. But I did want to mention earlier, you guys have stated just being mindful of making sure we don't start something and try to change it years later when you begin it, making sure you do everything the right way, and you follow the structure that you want in place for a long time, because it's really difficult to change something once you've been doing it for so long. So I just really appreciated that piece of advice, because as a board, we've been discussing that for a few weeks, and that's something that we kind of struggle with as a board sometimes. So for you guys to mention it, I just really appreciated it. So thank you.
I guess I wanted to add on to that. So I like the idea of the house, and about, I wonder, we're talking about the cement, right? The things that are actually going to create this house. When you talk about a brick and mortar building, you can't not have a cement to kind of solidify and have it look like something. And so, especially Mr. Kim, hearing you talk about your job specifically, some of those things, some of those cases, we kept hearing about on the news. It's just, I'm really curious about, how many employees did you manage, and and how, when you talk about not having a cookie cutter model, because that's another thing that we've encountered in some of our discussions. How did you take your different experiences and not have it look like, or when you talk about a cookie cutter model, how did your different experiences kind of lead you to kind of what you're doing now, and as opposed to when you're looking at other review boards and what that model should look like?
So clearly, not one, what's that, the idiom, the one size doesn't fit all. And I think that's why Professor Sullivan and Ms. Malik talked about this has to be unique to Rochester and the charter, as well as the community and the type of cases that comes up. And in terms of investigative component of it, the one thing that there is a common thread is how well the investigators are trained and then retrained, and then oversight of those investigators occur. So in complex type of cases, so there is no exact manual that's going to say, okay, this type of case, I'm going to look at 1, 2, 3 steps, and I know what the ideal outcome is, versus you learn in terms of how to process and look for additional evidence and components to solidify or strengthen the case for its presentation associated with it. And each city is going to have different set of rules and expectations, as well as policy. NYPD was based on patrol guide. So, what those rules patrol guide indicate, what are the rules and regulations and law that's associated with it. And that's why I keep always going back to training aspect of it, and hiring the right type of people to understand how to investigate. Because someone who's exceptional investigator, for example, let's say at a certain federal agency, could become a great investigator somewhere else in terms of understanding the new culture and direction. But it comes, if they were trained inappropriately, or in a not succinct and top-notch way, then they will never become a good investigator. So I think that is I would say in terms of there's no real right answer aspect of it, but it has to be customized and tailored to what is needed in Rochester. And I think that is absolutely critical. And, when we're talking about training manual and SOP and policy, PMP aspect of it, it's not building a cookie cutter aspect of it, but framework and a structure. And to me, SOP, what that does is when an investigator is looking at process of investigative steps, there is a common theme and structure associated with it. But that doesn't mean it's like solving an equation. If that's that easy, then obviously then we don't even need to have this discussion. So I hope I was able to address your question.
Yes,
But
thank you.
New York, we had ton of investigators, but we needed to really build a training mechanism from the ground up, and recruit additional. And whereas and in Midwest, well, whether it was in Chicago or even with the state of Illinois, when a new agency was being spun out, we started out with the new recruitment, new title, new academy, and then building in a new culture and training mechanism. So
Yeah, and I would just say, I think the real question boils down to, what do the people of Rochester need, right? And what do they need in terms of a police accountability board? And what are you all looking to achieve as you go forward, being the board members and the staff of the new Rochester Police Accountability Board? Does Rochester care about data collection and analysis and transparency and turning out annual reports, turning out reports maybe on the use of tasers, right? Or use of force? Does the public want that? Do they need that? And so when we talk about this cookie cutter approach, it's not a one size fits all. It's really tailored to what the needs of the communities in your area are, the needs of what Rochester has and your needs as a board.
Thank you. Board Member Perez.
So I agree with Danielle. I think you guys have shared so much information that's really helped us look at this in a different way. I know there's been a lot of talk around our budget, and there's been some suggestions as to hiring people from employment agencies. And I just wanted to know, how did you guys handle your staffing, and where did those staffing come from? And did you ever use any kind of hiring, agencies that can provide you staff, or were staff completely under your authority and selection, and part of your actual staff and not from an agency?
We created a very robust interviewing system as well as a recruiting system. And, quite frankly, not only were we looking for the best and the brightest, but we were also looking for people who are passionate about the work that we do. And I think that is absolutely critical, because you could take somebody who is the best and the brightest, but if they're not passionate about police accountability, if they're not passionate about seeking justice, if they're not passionate about serving the communities, then that person may not be the best fit for the job. And you can't fit a square peg into a round hole.
So I just want to clarify, was there ever use of like a temp agency, or were you directly responsible?
No.
Okay.
I would strongly recommend against that.
Let's check.
Okay.
Maybe not a temp agency, but like just contracting out the work so that it's not, it's another agency that does the hiring and administrative work, even if it's not a temp agency.
So, there's a utility in that, but if you're creating a technology firm or some other entity, maybe, but you're talking about recruiting investigators with sound legal mind and who has a passion for this type of work. It's uniquely different in that you have to create a mechanism of recruitment and vetting process. And maybe there are some entities that we don't know about. That's a possibility. But whether it's a Chicago or when I was with the state of Illinois, complete revamping the EJJ aspect of it, we didn't farm that out because we wanted to have a say and be involved at the front end and then during the training and then how they were vetted out. So.
Dr. McIntosh?
So I think a lot of my questions were answered. I had some stuff around the police unions, but I think Ms. Malik answered that. But I guess just to clarify, Rabbi Settle asked the question about how you guys would work with us, but I don't remember hearing kind of like a timeline, the availability after, if we were able to work with you and get up and running, like what would be the involvement after? How long would you be a resource after? And is there, and maybe I missed this in the beginning, but in terms of, collecting data and metrics and evaluation, I don't know if you spoke to any of that.
So I firmly believe in building strong relationships. And so when you talk about, would we be available after having worked with you and gotten things set up, including a robust recruitment and interviewing process, I think that it's imperative and it's very important for us to maintain that relationship and that connection. And certainly, we're happy to be there for whatever your needs are, should they arise after we work with you initially. Quite frankly, working with the circuit attorney in St. Louis, we've been working with her for a while. This is our second go round. So we don't walk away from our projects after they're done. We make sure that we're still available, and the three of us are all readily available.
And then in terms of data is, I'm a numbers guy, I love numbers, but having and collecting the right data and then utilizing it, analyzing it is absolutely critical in terms of not only for patterns and practice, policy review and recommendation. One of the most challenging thing that we faced at CCRB was they had data. They collected a whole bunch of data, but the data table was corrupt. So, and certain data going back, X number of years, we had no confidence. So in order to sort that through, that was a major undertaking and had to essentially bring in a national expert to help us sort that out. And then the data is one thing, interpreting is one thing, and then presentation is another thing. So how do we create a data visualization that public and then policymakers and internally within the staff clearly understood and was meaningful? Because otherwise then you really don't know where you're going and why.
Right, and I'll give you a concrete example also of what we experienced at the CCRB. I think it was the first or second week on the job for me. And I got a call from a New York Times reporter who was asking about statistics and facts on police encounters with the LGBTQ community. And I said, let me find out and I'll call you back. So I go to our data person at the time and he said, we don't collect that information. We don't ask. And so I was amazed at that. And that is one of the things that we changed. So we started collecting that information and that data, and we started analyzing it. And eventually we came up with a report about police encounters with the LGBTQ community. And we published it and issued it. So, it's very critical to collect the data at the intake stage and to ask the right questions at the intake stage. When that case is coming into your office, those questions need to be asked and answered so that you can properly collect the data for later analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And the last question will go to Dr. Harrison.
Ms. Malik, I apologize. I get twisted up and confused all the time about words. But when you were talking a little while ago, you made several references to what the community needs. You used the term needs several times. You never used the term wants. And it occurred to me that might be meaningful, that you might be maybe subconsciously harking back to the idea that what communities need are not always what they want. What has been your experience?
In terms of,
of a discrepancy between community needs and community wants.
right. So I think in terms of community needs, that could be all encompassing, especially when you're talking about police accountability. And, maybe what the community wants may be all encompassing and overarching. I think that's important as well. And maybe because, you're Navy and I'm Army, we might not be talking about the same thing, but, I think that, when you're talking about community needs and community wants, sometimes what the community wants may not always be what they need. But I think it's important to address what the community demands as well.
And I think the larger point there. So we didn't set out to make a distinction between wants and needs in any of our descriptors, but the larger point is that there are several components and factors that go into how we structure a program, and one is the community, what they want and what they need. Now that you've articulated the distinction, and it's a real distinction, of course, that is one factor among the many other factors that Mina listed in terms of how we come in and work with a board and how we advise on structuring a program. So I think that was the point of that response. To the degree that there is divergence between wants and needs of the community, that are, in our experience, that's largely taken care of by legislative constraints anyway. There are only certain things these boards can do, and oftentimes wants can go far beyond that. So it's, at least in my experience in looking at many of these, if not all of these across the country, is that what you're suggesting has not been a major issue around the country.
Well, I thank the three of you. I've really enjoyed this presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to the three of you for coming to speak to us. We could stay for a few more hours asking you all questions about, the intricacies of, what you would like to do for us. I would really like to still come up with some questions, because I know we'll have more, especially now if we can take a look at your PowerPoint presentation and just look at some of the other things that you're asking for. I know I had some questions about, the forensic analysts and about what that looks like, and, what that, just so some of the things that you have encountered that you think that the city would benefit from. So I wonder if we can either bring you all back, or if we can just continue to ask you some questions.
And my hope is we can ask those questions in a more formal relationship, hopefully in the near future.
So I'm going to actually, since it is late, I'm going to just thank you all so much for coming. And then I think we're going to have to move on, because we still have to go into executive session to discuss some things, Connor.
Yeah, so, I just want to, again, thank everyone for coming. Mina and the team, I don't know if you have anything else you want to say before you go.
I just want to thank all of you, Chair Wilson and the board members and everyone, for having us and giving us this wonderful opportunity to address you. And I hope that we have an opportunity to work together in the near future. I think, as I said in the beginning, you have this fantastic and unique opportunity to make your organization the gold standard for the entire country, and have people look at you and look to you for guidance.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Nice meeting you.
Nice to meet you too.
All right, well, while we're letting
Thank
them,
you, guys.
while we're letting them go, folks, we're going to be going into executive session to talk about the specific details of hiring and a employment offer we're making. New York state law says that boards can go into executive session to discuss that because it's sensitive data about people, personnel, that kind of thing. So the board is going to be voting to briefly go into that session. We'll go offline, we'll come back, and then probably just end the meeting. So this is effectively in for the folks. Thanks for taking a listen with us.
Okay, so now I'm going to hear a motion to move into executive session just based on specific details of the employment offer and other issues that Connor described.
A motion.
I second.
Okay, all in favor of going to executive session?